you ready?
1, 2, 3.
Three, clap. Hello, Divya.
Hi, Magnus.
Welcome to the engine room.
So exciting.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you so much.
It's your first time.
It is my first time actually in front of a camera.
Oh, interesting.
Yes,
interesting.
yes.
Today we're talking about revenue analytics. And that's something you're good at, and it's something that you're passionate about.
You could say that.
So introduce yourself to the people out there.
All right. I'm just going to look at you just to be easy, right? But yeah, my name's Divya. I moved to Copenhagen about 4.5 years ago now. And since I've moved here, I worked in a lot of startups/scale-ups, primarily in surrounding revenue operations. So when I started off, I started working at a company called Templify, where I was in the revenue operations team. While I was there, my initial responsibilities when I was a student assistant was primarily building dashboards. But then once I became a full-timer and I started working full-time, I think my work sort of evolved into working with Power BI, trying to do some forecasting, revenue modeling, very much internal to Templify. Once I moved on from Templify, I moved into another startup called Growblocks, where I was a customer engineer. The whole idea of Growblocks was to help with revenue modeling, funnel to funnel, so right from traffic through to churn. That meant my experience surrounding working with customers was that I would start mapping out the entirety of their funnel, so all the different touch points that they have, right from traffic, so your GA4, through to leads, so HubSpot or Salesforce, through to churn. That meant that I was working with multiple CRM systems and also subscription tools because of that. Having worked with about, I'd say somewhere around 18 to 25 customers during my time at Growblocks, I think I gained a bit more experience on how exactly do you do your reporting right? How do you make sure that you're tracking all the different key points that a sales funnel needs to have? Because I think something that is very important that people tend to forget is, hey, I need to actually focus on this specific part of the sales funnel, but do I know whether we are doing it right? Oh, I can't because there's no data for it, right? That sort of sparks a very big conversation with a lot of people that I talk about saying, hey, are you tracking this? If I were to ask you, how did you do this in the last 6 months? Can you tell me about it, right? That is kind of what my expertise has been on before I came to SparkForce. And then it's a whole new world because I was never so much involved in being in marketing. My knowledge for marketing was very limited and restricted because for me, marketing was you give the money, you get the leads. That was sort of the idea. I knew that it was a bit more nuanced than that, but I did not really have so much expertise on what exactly happened. What are the different tools that you guys use? What do you actually do in marketing, right? There's so many different kinds of marketing as well. It's been a revelation, I think I can say at the least, and then it's been a learning journey so far, for sure.
It is for all of us.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for that intro. So the topic that you're very passionate about and what you've been working with for a long time, I think to a lot of folks out there, it's still somewhat obscure as to what is it actually. I was at a networking event the other day, and most of the companies there were looking to gain investors to then be able to scale more. Now, the majority of these investors were basically curious about, well, how did you get to this point? And most of the folks there, it's difficult to be able to say, well, we got here because of this, because then the investors asked, well, do you have a repeatable sales process, right? And then they're like, maybe, maybe not. Can you tell us what's working and where do you turn up the dial? They were like, it's also difficult to say. And so it got me thinking, well, if you did some revenue analytics, not just in terms of revenue, but also in terms of deals, maybe you could figure that out. So my initial question to you is for everybody out there and potentially listening, what is revenue analytics? And when we say revenue analytics, what is it we mean, right? And what is it not?
Oh, that's a great question. Also because it is so vast in nature when you talk about revenue analytics, right? From the overarching point, I would say it is essentially everything that leads up for you winning that $1 of money for the company. And like you said, if a company has a repeatable sales funnel, right? Something that they know works, something that they're able to replicate on, and not necessarily founder sales, because founder sales can happen because of the person that's actually selling it. But if you have a sales team and you have a repeatable sales process that is working, revenue analytics essentially would help you identify, saying, okay, if I have 1,000 deals that I'm creating within a year, how many of them go through certain stages within the sales process before I get that one signed contract? Or how many deals do I need to get that one signed contract? Of course, that goes beyond that, saying once you close the deal, how much do we grow a customer? How long do we retain the customer? How do you see churn? And when do you see churn? Depends on contract lengths and all those. That's a different complicated part altogether. But to even understand, to get the new $1 in, what do we need? To sort of do like a backtracking, saying, okay, I need $100. If I were to look at my sales funnel right now, considering my conversion rates, considering how long it takes to close that one deal, how many leads do I need to create within the business? And in this case, when I say leads, it is kind of replaceable to deals, right? Because how many deals do you need that are ready to be worked on to get that one single dollar of or one single contract? Yeah.
Another question then, because I bet you that some of those companies that I talked to the other day, maybe they do not have a CRM. And when we're talking about revenue analytics as to how you and I understand it, which relates back to just what you just said, we think about all these different data points that are available in the CRM.
Mm-hmm.
Can you also do revenue analytics if it's off of an Excel? And how does that journey work going from an Excel to a CRM? But let's first start with the Excel part. Is it possible?
Yes, definitely. I think as long as you have the main data points that can tell you, let's say you have a sales funnel where your first entry point is a meeting that is being booked with a salesperson. You have the first meeting point that tells you that's your starting point. And then let's say you have another crucial point where, say, an SDR is potentially handing it over to an AE, who's then working the deal, doing a lot of different things. And then another key point is potentially when the contract goes out or when we do a POC. As long as you're able to track all these different key points, saying, I can tell you when each of these points have happened, you're free to do it anywhere. Because at the end of the day, the thing that is the most important to remember is it is not the CRM system that's the problem. It's the data that you're tracking. That's the issue, right? Because you should be able to, at any point of time, be able to identify what are my key stages within a sales funnel. And can I say when a specific deal has passed through those stages? Because another problem that tends to happen more often, especially within the CRMs, right, is people can skip stages. So you could have a deal that is being created today and being closed one tomorrow. But I, as a potential AE, knows that it's actually a lot longer than that. Because I probably actually started working the deal 3 months ago. But I know for a fact that it is closing tomorrow. I forgot to put it in the CRM. Let me just put that in. Let me close it so I can get my commission. Right. I'm not saying it's a typical mentality of people, right? But it is something that does happen more often than not, especially if you're looking at founder sales, because the founder has so much that they're working on. They kind of need to take care of the business. They need to take care of the product. They need to work through a lot of different things. That maintaining that data is not that important. But if you have a team that is now able to do this, it becomes really important to track those key points across the board. So you can tell when you look back saying, how did we perform this year? Then you can very confidently say, hey, we had 100 meetings booked that we had within the last quarter. Of that, we went to 35 of them went to the AE because we believe they were good enough. And that 35, you could say, I don't know, 20 of them became closed won, right? That gives you a very clear explanation saying, how is your sales process working? And is it repeatable enough? Can you actually depend on this conversion rates to tell what your future could look like?
And that sort of leads back to the question I wanted to ask you next, which we should have probably covered in the first half, which is like, why even care about this? I sort of hinted towards it, right? Investors may want to know. But then you also say, then we just talked about, okay, going from an Excel to a CRM like HubSpot. And then we have, that's one process. Then you have the data hygiene, onboarding a team, going from founder-led sales, where there is a process, maybe founder hasn't actually figured out himself or herself how to repeat it.
Or never thought it was important enough.
Never thought it was important enough to basically record that sales process, right? To bring salespeople on board. And suddenly it's really difficult. You see that a lot with like seed and Series A companies where they hire salespeople, they hire head of sales, and suddenly sales cannot actually close any deals because it's never been documented, right? And there's never perhaps been the data input from the get-go to actually give realistic expectations as to how deals move through. So the first question for you here is why even care? Like why even care about these revenue analytics? What is it for? So just so we have it perfectly clear, like why should everybody do it? That's a loaded question, but let's try it.
I think a very simple answer that I would say is, let's say you're trying to raise money, or let's say you have investors, and you have a finance team that says, hey, I need to grow this much, right? When you have to grow that much, there's a certain amount of revenue that you know, or the finance team says, hey, this is the new revenue that you're supposed to bring in. If you have a repeatable sales funnel, which is not always the case when a new sales team comes in, we can get to that later. But the idea is, if you know how much you want to win, you can use all of these data points to say, what should my starting point be if I want that to be my end point? It's kind of like the unit economics, right? So you say, hey, if I need to get, 2 million in closed won by the end of the year, how much does that mean in terms of getting how many deals for the year? Because then you have key information like average cycle days. You have key information like average deal size that's coming in. You have key information like conversion rates. And then if you add all of the components of how many salespeople are, what is the productivity like, how much money do you keep in marketing, what's your output, that's another discussion, right? But when you combine all of those things, it essentially allows you to predict into the future, saying, if that is my end goal, what does my starting point need to look like? How much do I need as a fuel to get me to that point? Because that's where all your pipeline velocity comes into play, saying how quickly do you run through your deals, what's your win rate like, what's your average deal size like, that helps you get to that point. That's where this becomes important to track.
Okay, so that's also the message to founders, which is that the earlier you start tracking some of these things, the better off you are. Because if you're then tasked to, and we see that a lot where companies want to grow by a certain percentage. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 100. And most likely they haven't actually calculated whether that's feasible or not.
I think it becomes a little risky when you're going directly from founder sales to hitting 50% growth, right? Because, correct me if you think the ideology is wrong, but when it comes to founder sales, people are typically buying the founder. They're not really buying the product, because the product is still growing. The product is still going through a lot of different iterations. So if a founder is selling a product, they're buying it based off the founder's goodwill. They're not really, so if a salesperson were to start selling the product that the founder was recently selling, the salesperson doesn't really have a lot of goodwill that they're working with. They cannot really saying, oh, you know me, so you can buy the product. That's not how it works, right? So you kind of need the new sales team. That is where actually you set the foundation, saying, hey, this is the sales process that we want to stick with. This is what we think should be repeatable. And then once you have enough data, you can say, okay, you know what, when we have a first meeting booked, we need to make sure that we have all of this information to make sure that we can identify if this customer is ICP enough for our product, if it is good enough. And then you create exit criteria for each of your stages. Once you create those different data points is when you can actually build on it. That is the point where you can say this is predictable. When you're going from a founder sales to sales rep, that is not predictable enough, because the whole nature is completely different. A founder sales is very much dependent on the founder, but the sales team is dependent on the product. They depend on the service that is being sold for it to be good, that people can actually, they can send it on. That's where all your messaging and your value drivers all come into play, right? But that is the point where you need to get your foundation right. A founder is not going to worry so much about getting the sales process right, because his initial focus is going to be on making sure that they have enough money in the first place, that they're selling enough. Once the founder is comfortable saying, hey, you know what, I think this is the time where we probably need to get more resources in, is when they need some sort of guidance saying, hey, this is what your typical sales process should look like. Try focusing on these things that you tend to do across your sales process before you close your deal.
Okay. So there's two questions that I have. What data points should be mapped at that point? So let's say, the founder is starting to sell. And whether that's recorded in Excel or in a CRM like HubSpot, let's first start there. What data points should always be recorded for someone like you to come in and help build a repeatable process?
Well, that's a very good question. I think if you were to keep to when they sign the deal, right, or when they decide saying we're not going to buy the product, is tracking why. Why are they buying the product. What's the reason for choosing the product? What are the success metrics that they're looking for? And why are they not buying the product? So that will help your product team to figure out what is it that they need to focus on. But then apart from that, I think it would also help the founder to sort of track saying, when are they starting the discussion with the prospect? When is the first decision-making point for the prospect that they're talking to? And then ideally, if they think there are more iterations needed, so let's say you have to build a proposal for the customer, and there's a specific kind of process if that goes by with it, right? Track that, and then you can ascend, then after that, do when you close one, the customer. I think those are the main ones. You can always add more. Yeah. A simple process that has at least 2 to 3 touch points, right, that you can track on. Hopefully, there's not too much time gap. That's when it becomes tricky. If 2 of your different sales stages have a lot of time gap, is when you might need to consider adding another stage if you're doing few touch points with your customer, where the salesperson is going back to the customer saying, hey, do we need to discuss something, right? That's probably another key point that you need to consider if your sales cycle is really long. If it is not, you do not need to make it complicated. I think that's a very big misconception that people tend to have, saying, I need to have a 10-step sales funnel. No, you do not. You're good to go with just a 3-step sales funnel, saying opportunity created, qualified, closed won. But if your sales cycle tends to increase further and further, that means that the likelihood that you're having to do certain things specific within each of the stages come through, then that probably becomes your key point to start identifying. And that comes with practice. You cannot predict those things from the beginning. So you can always start with a very simple funnel saying, hey, these are when I'm creating the deal. This is probably when I'm qualifying it, or where they're like, yeah, we're kind of looking to buy now, and then we closed one. Those would be your starting points. And then you grow from it, saying, okay, if the decision process takes time, reiterate, try to figure. But then try to make it very clear and consistent as to why exactly are those points being added, what should be done before you leave that stage, and just try to make sure that you're tracking all those stages properly.
Okay, so that would be like the early iteration of doing
keep
this.
It simple. You do not need to make it complicated right from the beginning. The more data points come in, that's fine later on, but just make sure that you're tracking the simple steps at the least.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Would you say that company size, all these other things, where we think about basically defining the ideal customer profile, would you say that's also necessary?
Yes, absolutely.
And what would that look like?
Different for different customers and different for different products, right? Because I think you could be a new company that is only meant to sell for smaller businesses. Then you probably need to know that you're actually selling to a small business. Or maybe you want to know, hey, is this product only going to work for a specific industry? I think once you actually look at the founder sales enough, where hopefully they're tracking enough information about what does a company do and stuff like that, you can then build the ideal customer profile, right? But some of the more common things that usually tend to come across are, which regions are they selling in? If they're selling to massive companies, are they selling to the headquarters? Are they selling to the subsidiaries? Or because that kind of changes whether they're cross-selling and upselling. Trying to understand which region they're selling to, trying to understand which industries are they selling to, because that would help them identify, do they need to then start focusing on making their use cases industry specific, or can it be generic enough? Because you could have some companies where the product that they're selling is cost efficient, but cost efficient to whom? Does it work across the board? Does it work only very specific for niche industries? Trying to identify those things, which is why they're buying the product becomes important to track. Saying, what is it giving them? I think some important things that definitely come through are, the industry. I would say the company size, essentially how big is the company? And then potentially trying to understand if you are, sorry, where was I going with this? I think if you can explain whether they are, the person that is buying, if you can try to explain what the job title of the person is, that will also tell you, or at least inform you from beforehand, saying, do you need to sell only to specific kind of people? If that is repeatable enough, right? It's saying, I can only sell this product if I know that the CFO has the buy-in. Yeah. Then you know that that's a fact that the salespeople need to target or maybe need to focus on when they're trying to prospect. So I think those are some of the more common things that come through.